Thank you very much, Jock. And congratulations, Joe, from all the writers who are here. I know there's 5 pages of thank yous that you had, but we all know who brains behind this event. I want to begin by saying something that's so blindingly self-evident, you'll wonder why I'm bothering even to mention it. But I'd like to take a moment just to remind us all of what it means to be human. Being human, whether you like it or not, means that you're stuck with being a member of a social species. Like many other species on planet Earth, we humans are born to connect. We're born to congregate. We're born to communicate. Neuroscientists tell us it's in our DNA. They can peep into our brains in the way that psychologists and philosophers and mystics in the past could only dream about, and they can find the cooperative centre in the human brain. By the way, they can't find the competitive centre. That's a socially conditioned response. We get quite good at it under some circumstances. But when we're being absolutely true to our human nature, true to our DNA, we are cooperators. We behave as if we belong to a social species. We know that, don't we? We know that we're hopeless in isolation. We need families, we need friendship circles, we need colleagues, we need workmates, we need groups and communities of all kinds to nurture us and sustain us and to give us that all-important sense of belonging that is fundamental to life in Port Fairy, but it's fundamental to the mental and emotional health of anyone who belongs to a social species. So we're born to be together. And what that means is that we are also born with the capacity for all those qualities we need in order to be together. We're not just born communitarians, though we are. We're not just born cooperators, though we are. We're also born with the innate capacity for the qualities that allow us to do what is really the grand human project on which we're all engaged because we belong to this species, which is creating and maintaining social harmony. That's why we're here. So that means we're equipped with the capacity for kindness, the capacity for compassion, the capacity to show respect towards each other because we share this common humanity with each other. Now that doesn't mean we all spring from the womb being kind. We know that isn't the case. We know that kindness, like all these other qualities, has to be nurtured, has to be encouraged and reinforced, particularly while kids are young. We have a language centre in the brain also, like the cooperative centre. That doesn't mean we're born able to speak the mother tongue. It means we're born with the capacity for language. We're born with the capacity for kindness, but it has to be nurtured. So let's define it. I guess everyone in the theatre knows what kindness is. Do I need to define kindness? By the way, kindness is a cut-down version. The real word is loving kindness, and that's a very eloquent, much lovelier word, isn't it? Because it conveys so much more than kindness. But of course, we're all too busy to say a word as long as loving kindness anymore, so we just say kindness. But what is it? To define it, we just have to remind ourselves again of what it means to be human. Because we're human, because we need each other, because we have this fundamental desire to know that we belong somewhere, I think and kindness as anything we do to show another person that they belong. Anything we do to show another person that we take them seriously. Anything we do to show another person that we've heard them, we've noticed them, we appreciate them, we acknowledge them. And when I say anything, I mean literally anything. Saying good day to a total stranger you pass in the street. smiling at someone saying it looks like rain, or worse. I heard a chilling story in Canberra last year about a young man who attempted to take his own life by jumping off a bridge. He survived the attempt. And the person who rescued him said the first thing that young man said when he hauled him out of the water was, "If someone smiled at me, I wouldn't have jumped." Is that about the most harrowing thing you've ever heard? If someone smiled at me, I wouldn't have jumped. Might be just a smile to a total stranger that in that moment pulls them back from the brink of despair because you've simply acknowledged them. Probably one of the most eloquent acts of kindness we ever display towards each other is what you're doing right now, and I'm deeply grateful, namely listening. When we listen attentively and with empathy to another person, without having to put it into words at all, what we're saying is, I take you seriously enough to bother listening to what you have to say. I take you seriously enough to entertain your ideas. By the way, I might think your ideas are rubbish. We might be headed for a knockdown, drag-out argument about your ideas. Fine. But I'm not even entitled to argue with you until I've fully heard, respectfully heard, what your position is. By the way, that's a huge challenge many of us are facing in the lead up to the referendum, showing respect towards people who happen to have a different view from ours, listening respectfully and attentively to views that are different from our own. That's what we're saying when we listen. And if you doubt it, just think what it feels like when someone doesn't listen. Again, without having to put it into words, when you withhold the therapeutic gift of listening to another person, what you're saying in effect is, sorry, I don't take you seriously enough to bother listening to you. I'm not even prepared to entertain your ideas. Now, would you ever say that to a partner or a neighbour or a child or a colleague? Of course you wouldn't. It'd be too hurtful. It'd be too offensive. Yet that's what we're saying in effect whenever we fail to listen to someone who needs us to listen to them. Now, our capacity for kindness, as I've suggested, is one of our central characteristics, one of what Abraham Lincoln described as the better angels of our nature. Of course, we don't always value it as much as we should, do we? It can very easily be pushed aside by ego-driven impulses, things that we want in the short term for selfish motives can push away or temporarily suppress our capacity for kindness. And for reasons that I'm going to explore in a moment, I think Jock hit the nail on the head a moment ago when he said we're living in a peculiarly unkind period in the evolution of Western civilization. But it is a remarkable quality. In fact, I think of kindness as a unique form. That's why I like the word loving kindness better. I think of kindness as a unique form of human love. Every form of human love is wonderful, isn't it? Romantic love is exciting and energizing, and familial love, for most families, solid as companionate love. Where would we be without the love of the friends who sustain us? All of those forms of love have one thing in common. They're to do with the emotions. They're to do with affection. Even when we use love in contexts like I love chocolate, or I love Port Fairy, or I love this dog, or I love that book, we're talking about an emotional response to all those things. But here's this wonderful, unique form of human love that has nothing to do with affection. If there was only one thought you carried away from our time together tonight, in fact, with due respect to all the other authors, if there was only one thought you carried away from this weekend, I'd like it to be this one. We are capable of showing kindness towards people we don't like. Nothing to do with love. in that sense. It's a different kind of love. We're capable of showing kindness towards people with whom we could never agree about politics or religion or culture or anything else. We're capable of showing kindness towards total strangers. I mean, this is something I often feel like cheering about when I wake up in the morning. This is worthy of daily celebration. You belong to a species with that capacity. We're able to be kind. Samuel Johnson got it right 250 years ago. He got a lot of other things wrong, in my opinion, but he got this right. Kindness is in our power, even when fondness is not. Write that down and stick it up on the fridge. That's great, isn't it? But it doesn't. You don't have to like someone. You don't have to agree with them. You don't even have to know them, as I said. And you don't have to qualify in any way. It's pouring with rain. Someone has come out of the IGA. They've got a plastic bag full of shopping. They're crossing the road. The plastic bag bursts and you're standing nearby. You're running for a meeting. You don't particularly want to get, what are you going to do? You know what you're going to do. You're going to rush over and help, because this is a fellow human, same place, same time, needs help, needs a bit of kindness, I'll show it. Do you say, look, I see you're in need of a bit of help here, but how are you proposing to vote in the referendum? Or now, do you believe that Jesus rose bodily? I mean, there are just a few check questions. What's your favourite author? We don't do that, do we? We don't run through a checklist. We don't qualify people for our kindness. We are kind to them because it's in our nature. It's not heroic. It's us being truly human when we're being kind, when we're showing compassion, when we're showing respect even for the people that we could never like or agree with. So that's what it means to be human. And let me just ask you to pause there for a moment and reflect on what I've said. That's humans, is it? Right? That's the kind of species we belong to. That's worth celebrating every day. Terrific. What went wrong? How come Jock could say correctly, we live in an unkind... What? We're living at a time in which, in large numbers, we're not being true to our human nature. Could that be true? Sadly, it could be true. And let me invite you, in the second section of what I want to share with you tonight, let me invite you just to reflect, those of you who are old enough to go back 30 or 40 years, let me invite you to reflect on what's been happening to Australian society over the last 30 or 40 years, and not only Australia. We could be saying the same thing if we were talking about virtually any Western democracy comparable with ours. The story of our society and societies like ours over the last 30 or 40 years has been the story of a number of really fundamental changes to the way we live, big differences in the choices we've made about how we're going to live compared with the choices made by our parents' and grandparents' generation, creating a series of really powerful social trends that have radically reshaped the kind of society we've become, not in the direction of promoting social harmony, not in the direction of making us kinder, more mutually respectful, more collaborative in our approach, not in the direction of building up social cohesion, but in precisely the opposite of all those things. This has been a period, and I'll run very quickly through a few examples of what I'm talking about. This has been a period in which we have become not more harmonious, but more discordant. A period in which we have not become more cooperative and collaborative, but more polarized. Which social cohesion has been eroded, and, as I say, like many other Western societies around the world, a period in which our society has become characterized by increasing social fragmentation, to the point where now we have social isolation as our number one public health issue. We used to say our number one public health issue was obesity because of all the health consequences that flow from obesity, and that's still a huge problem for us, greater even than the problem of obesity as a public health issue is social isolation because of all the health consequences that flow from social isolation, anxiety, depression, hypertension, inflammation, sleep disorders, increased vulnerability to addiction, and now demonstrably proven in studies in various parts of Western society, reduced life expectancy associated with social isolation. This is us. People who belong to a social species, people whose innate character is to cooperate, born with the capacity for kindness, for reaching out, for showing respect, for being kind even to all those things I said. This is us. And we're suffering from an epidemic of social isolation. How did it happen? Well, we don't have time to explore this in depth tonight. There is quite a good book on the table outside that explores some of these issues. But let me just very quickly mention some of, you'll recognize this. None of this is news. These are not things that have been done to us. There was no cosmic finger wagging and saying, I'm going to do a few things to your society and see how you like it. No. These are our trends. These are the choices we've made. These are things we have done to ourselves without knowing what we were doing. Only now are we beginning to understand the depth and the severity of the consequences. Things like the biggest single change in the character of our and comparable societies over the last 50 years, the shrinking household. It's like the climate change of demography. We saw it coming, we knew what the factors were driving it, we know what its consequences are, and we've just let it happen. Now, many of you, I'm sure, live alone, are already muttering and saying, what's he on about? I'm perfectly happy living alone. It's a choice I've made. Let's look at the dimension of it, though. By the way, it's not only the last 50 years. In Australia, our households have been shrinking for the last 100 years. In the last 100 years, our population has increased fivefold. The number of households in Australia has increased tenfold. We've been growing households at twice the rate we've been growing the population. In other words, our households have been shrinking, while simultaneously you will have noticed our houses are getting bigger and bigger to house fewer. We're a nation of spare rooms. That's a good way of describing us at the moment. And we, of course, have a major problem of homelessness. 120,000 Australians tonight, nowhere to call home. That's another subject. So shrinking households. We've reached the point where every fourth household in Australia contains just one person. The Bureau of Statistics says within the next 10 to 15 years, that'll be every third household, if present trends continue. Every third household will contain just one person. That's not the kind of society any of us grew up in. Now, as I've already acknowledged, there are plenty of people who've chosen to live alone and love it. They say, look, I've got a family, I've got friends, I've got work colleagues, I've got neighbours, I can socialise till I'm ready to drop with exhaustion, and then I go home and shut the door and punch the air and say, peace at last. A bit of solitude, just what I need. And we all do need a bit of solitude, by the way. That's another issue. Yes, there are lots of people who feel like that, and there are lots of people who don't. There are lots of people who don't go home and punch the air and celebrate, but who say before they go out, they turn on the lights and the television, so they won't feel as they're coming home, as if they're coming home to an achingly empty house. They live with a sense of social isolation or loneliness or worse. They've been pitchforked into solo householder status by bereavement or relationship breakdown and so on. So there's as many stories as there are solo householders, and I'm sure there are many solo householders in the theatre. But as a national trend, we've reached a point where it is a significant contributor to the problem of social isolation. When every third or fourth household contains just one person, obviously the risk of social isolation is greatly enhanced. Let me quickly run through a few other examples. Our rate of relationship breakdown, between 30% and 40% of contemporary marriages are ending in divorce. In many cases, that means a two-person household, at least for a while, becomes two single-person households. Hugely disruptive, a lot of pain, hugely disruptive for the couples, for their families, their extended families, their friendship circles, the neighbourhoods they're moving in and out of, and of course for kids, if there are any kids, and there often are, which is why 1 million dependent kids in Australia today are living with just one of their natural parents. And half of those kids, it's worth trying to visualise this, 500,000 kids are involved in a weekly or fortnightly migration from the home of the custodial parent to the non-custodial parent. Now, many families manage that brilliantly in the end, hardly any manage it brilliantly, and there's pain and anguish associated with that change. But it's now part of who we are, and it's certainly made its contribution to social isolation, as has the falling birth rate. Birth rate's the lowest it's ever been in our history. It's fallen again in the last 12 months. We're down to just under 1.6 babies per woman. There are probably some baby boomers in the house, are there? If you put your hand up if you're a baby. There's a sprinkling of baby boomers. When you were born, the birth rate was 3.6 babies per woman. It's now 1.6. Lowest on record. Why do I mention that? Well, any of you who are parents know that you move into a new neighbourhood, it's usually the kids who get to know the other kids first, and social networks often develop through contacts made on the school bus or in the playground and so on. Kids are a kind of social lubricant in that kind of society. Not in this kind of society. That's social. Relative to total population, we're producing the smallest number of children Australia has ever produced. So that social lubricant is in shorter supply. We're compensating, of course. You know how we're compensating. While the birth rate has been quite steeply falling, the rate of pet ownership has been rapidly rising, and we know that those pets, but there are now more pets than people in Australia, 28 million of them, 24.5 million of us. You know they're child substitutes, don't you, because of the names they're given. Just go to the local dog park and try and remember whether Nigel is the dog or the owner. Someone recently told me they thought that I'd like to know, they called their dog Hugh. Well, why not? I mean, we've had Nigella as a next-door neighbour. You can guess who her owner admired. Maybe that works for some people. It's not quite the same as kids. Anyway, let me very quickly wrap this up. We're more mobile than we've ever been. Australians now move house on average once every 6 years, just the same as North Americans. And of course, we're also more mobile in the sense that there's almost universal car ownership. I guess many of you can walk from A to B in Port Fairy, but in most of the towns and suburbs around Australia, that's not the case. I was speaking to a young woman recently who's just moved into a new housing development on the outskirts of Orange in the central west of New South Wales. And she said they've got all these lovely new houses with their lovely new driveways and their lovely new electric garage doors. So they all drive home, up goes the door, drive in, down goes the door. She's been there for 6 months and hasn't yet met the neighbour on one side. She met the other one accidentally when they were putting the garbage out one night. Car ownership is a blessing in many ways, but it's more or less cancelled footpath traffic. And in many outer metropolitan developments, the developers don't even bother with footpaths because they know they're not going to be used. Well, all of that contributes to social isolation and social fragmentation, as I'll just mention two others very quickly, as does busyness. Now, have you noticed how busy we all are and how proud we are of being busy? It's changed the way Australians greet each other. We say, "How you going, Jock? Busy?" As though, surely you're busy. You know, like, are you busy or are you dead? Is the switch on or off? And people say, even in retirement, I've retired, but I'm so busy I don't know how I ever found time to go to work. Why? This is the time for reflection. This is the time for nurturing relationships. No, we're all busy. And we wear it almost as a badge with pride. It's a kind of a justification for social isolation. The neighbours are having drinks on Friday. Sorry, too busy. Don't disturb Dad, he's busy. As though busyness is somehow the justification for withdrawing from social connection. Beware of busyness. Busyness is the great enemy of social cohesion. If you hear yourself saying, I'm busy, take a long, hard look in the mirror. And the other thing I'll put on this list very quickly, which you probably think should have been top of the list, is the information technology revolution. That curiously paradoxical revolution that's promised to keep us more connected than ever before in human history, and it has. And it's also made it easier than ever before in human history to stay apart from each other and to settle for contact via a screen rather than face-to-face. Particularly in the case of heavy users of social media, we've now reached the stage, I mentioned loneliness a moment ago, we've now reached the stage where the loneliest age group in Australian society, by the way, in general, 25% of, no, just 30%, 32%, the latest figure just out a week ago, 32% of Australian adults report feeling lonely most of the time. 32%. But the loneliest group in our society, where the figure is 38%, who feel lonely most of the time, are the 18 to 24-year-olds, who are the most connected generation in human history and the loneliest. Because, of course, there is no substitute for what we're doing right now. There's no substitute for face-to-face interaction based on eye. Neuroscientists tell us eye contact is the crucial ingredient in human relationships. If you doubt that, just see how you feel when you try to have a conversation with someone who refuses to make eye contact with you. Well, you can't make eye contact on a screen. You can stare at someone's eyes on the screen, but I have bad news. You're staring at a screen. It's not the same thing. Neurologically, it's not the same thing, but we're trying to fool ourselves into, and it's been a blessing through COVID. Yes, we've been able to keep in touch. It's a wonderful way of augmenting personal relationships. No substitute for personal relationships. Well, let me stop the list there. I'm sure you could give us another 6 trends that help to contribute to this problem of social fragmentation. But just look at the cumulative effect of those 5 or 6 trends that I've mentioned just now. Obviously, the cumulative effect is we have eroded social cohesion. We have become more socially fragmented. We've seen the rise of a rampant individualism in Australian society, and that's one of the things that does contribute to the unkindness, an obsession with the self. Now, you can see that in the rise of identity politics. You can see it in the rise of the obsession with personal identity. Personal identity is important, crucial to our mental health. But when we become obsessed about personal identity, about my gender, or my politics, or my ethnicity, or my religion, if that becomes the main thing, transcending my sense of our shared common humanity, that's a deeply unhealthy position for our society. So we do have now what you would have put in. I mean, if we'd sat around 40 years ago and said, okay, let's muck up this society a bit. Let's get more of them living alone. Let's break up 35% of their marriages. Let's get them busier than ever. Let's seduce them with a bit of technology. Let's get them more mobile than ever. We'll do all these things. What will happen? Well, we know what will happen. We know they're going to be lonelier than ever. We know they're going to be more anxious than ever. We know they're going to be more depressed than ever, because that's what happens to herd animals when they're cut off from the herd. That's what happens to members of a social species when they are fragmented. We have, and we do have, an epidemic of loneliness. We have an epidemic. I've given you the figures on loneliness. We have an epidemic of anxiety. We have an epidemic of depression. It's no accident, is it, that in our criminal justice system, the worst punishment we can think of is solitary confinement. That's the worst thing you can do to a member of a social species. We need to be very careful that we're not doing it to ourselves and each other. So I began by saying, this is what it means to be human. Now I'm saying, hey, what are we up to? What are these choices we've been making? What kind of society are we letting ourselves become that seems to be contradicting our essential nature? Well, to wrap it up, let's come right back to the present, for the last 3 or 4 years. 2020, 2019, worst bushfires on record, unprecedented floods in various parts of the country, and the pandemic, unprecedented use of the word unprecedented, you will have noticed over the last few years. What did those things do to us? The floods, the fires, the pandemic, what did they do? Suppose the storm this morning had been far worse. Suppose we were still without power. Suppose there were all kinds of disasters and houses unroofed in your street. What would that do to us? You know what it would do to us because we've got so many examples of what it does do to us. It brings out the best in us. Suddenly it reminds us of what it means to be human. There's a fire, there's a flood, there's a storm. We don't say, oh, gee, they're having it rough next door. What's on telly? Well, there's no power. I'll watch. I'll have to read by candlelight. No, we're in next door helping, aren't we? Someone's house burns to the ground. You don't say, oh, no, he's a no voter. I'm not going to help him. You're there helping. He's human. You remember what it means to be human. You remember that kindness, compassion, respect for the other, stepping in when help is needed, making personal sacrifices for the common good. Weren't we reminded of that all through COVID? Social, the lockdowns, the mask wearing, the keeping our distance, the hand sanitizing, all that sort of stuff. Things we did that were in some ways inconvenient for us, but we did them without blinking because that's what the common good required. And that's what always happens in human communities when there's a crisis. So the big question is, have we learned the lesson of the fires, the floods, and the pandemic? Or, as the pandemic starts to fade, and of course it hasn't yet gone completely, are we impatient to say, hey, let's get back to normal. Let's get back to the way it was. What? Let's get back to being more selfish. Let's get back to not paying so much attention to what's going on in the street. Let's get back to not being so willing to make sacrifices for the common good. Would that be what we wanted to go back to? Would we be so pathetic that we'd ignore these lessons that nature has handed us, that are lessons about our humanity? The early signs are depressing. There's an organisation in Melbourne, the Scanlon Foundation, who do an annual survey. They've been doing it for years on people's sense of belonging, their sense of social cohesion. And that's been, as you would expect from what I've been describing, that's been going down and down and down for the last 20 years. And in the last 3 or 4 years, the graph has finally turned up. And during the years of particularly the floods, fires, and then especially the pandemic, the sense of belonging, the sense of social cohesion has risen again. At the end of last year, Scanlon did their latest survey. The graph had turned down again. Already, those lessons appeared to be being forgotten. Surely not. Surely we're not going to be so pathetic as to let those lessons go. What about hanging on to those lessons and saying, nature's handed us a reminder of what it means to be human. Let's celebrate what it means to be human. Let's go on being the kind of people we are in a crisis. Let's turn the crisis into a revolution. And if we can do it in our culture, what about doing it with our national agenda? How would you like Australia to become known not as the lucky country, which of course was intended by Donald Horne all those years ago as an insult, saying, well, we just got by good luck, not good management. We've chosen to accept it as a compliment. How about we weren't known as the lucky country, but the loving country, the kind country? How would you feel about Australia if that was our reputation? Wouldn't it transform everything if federal governments, for example, applied kindness as the first criterion for judging any social or economic or other policy proposal? How would you feel if kindness was the criterion against which we were going to decide what to do about reconciliation, what to do about aged care, what to do about the yawning chasm between performance in public schools and private schools? On and on with the list of things that would be transformed if we committed ourselves to our true nature. But let's not get hung up on the big picture. That's not going to happen tomorrow. But here's what could happen tomorrow. We could internalize all this stuff that I've been talking about, and we could say, we could live like that. This room is full of writers and readers. That means the room is full of dreamers. And I'm no mind reader, I'm no magician, but I know what your dream is. When you dream of a better society, you don't dream of a less compassionate one, a kinder, tougher, more competitive one, do you? You don't dream of a society in which we say, let's not fool around talking to each other. If we disagree, let's just hit each other. Let's have a bit more violence. Let's get to the point. Of course, that's ridiculous. That's a nightmare. When you dream of a better society, you dream of a kinder, more compassionate, more tolerant, less violent, less cynical kind of society. Isn't that the case? And this is one of those dreams that we can actually make come true. We do it simply by everyone in this theatre, for a start, saying, as of now, I'm going to live as if it is that kind of society. And if enough of us live as if it is that kind of society, that's the kind of society it will become. Thank you.